This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And it's a fine day outside. It was a nice day for Christmas Day. I went to Chicago, had to negotiate all those vehicles on Dan Ryan and Eisenhower. I thought I did pretty well. It was like opera or orchestra or poetry, watching the cars wave in and out across 5 lanes. They knew their way, they knew what they were doing. It wasn't invasive, really, but you only had to leave a car length open and there was another car in it. But I didn't quite make it to Eisenhower. Somehow at 70 mile an hour, you don't get to read all the signs, and I ended up on Cermak, which was parallel to Eisenhower, and I was headed for Harlem, so I just went through the local district. You know, lots of lights and people and older buildings, and it was real Chicago. And I enjoyed that. The stoplights gave me a chance to look around, and then I got to Halstead and moved north into territory that used to be built up in the 30s with Frank Lloyd Wright type architecture, and I found my destination, and we had lots of friendly discussion and a wonderful meal, and I returned by Eisenhower because this time I could get on the western end and then move down to 90 and so back onto Dan Ryan and 57 with in the background there was the Sears Tower, and I enjoyed being there for a short while. I've tended to follow taillights back, taillights that one see where the bends are. Not that there's a lot of bends on 57, but I just move reasonably slowly and follow other cars. I talked to a trooper and said, "What do you do for surveillance now that the traffic is moving at a legitimate 70 mile an hour?" And he says, "Oh, I tend to look at trucks these days." And that was interesting. I actually followed his vehicle back. He was probably headed for Pasota, where there's a police headquarters, and may turn around. So I came back, and I was tempted to check out Christmas salvage in the dumpster, and that was interesting. There was not an overdose of garbage or salvageable garbage, but people did come up and offer me food because I look like I'm a homeless person digging in the garbage. I explained to people what we're doing, and that means they get a chance to take their $5 or $10 back. And sometimes they leave the contribution because they understand what we're doing. And just yesterday, though, I found 2 steel chairs in the garbage going to the landfill, and steel can be recycled. So I pulled that out, and I was wanting to mention plastic, because I think there are a lot of us that are very reserved about plastic and what it does to the environment, not only from an aesthetic point of view, but from a leachate point of view. And I have been salvaging 2 new kegs, or 3 new kegs. They are a new type of beer keg, and the fluid, which may be beer or wine or a special drink, can be various, is in a bag, and there's a way of putting pressure into this dome of plastic. It's like a ball of plastic, and it pushes out the material by pushing on the bag rather than pushing on the drink. So it has the claim of being a little bit more professional in that you don't put carbon dioxide into the beer or have other ways of moving the material into a drink. These big spheres are about a 1.5 feet across. They come in a cardboard container. I think to some extent that the idea is generated in Europe, but the literature suggests that this plastic sphere or keg is not always efficient, in that if you have a brewery nearby, to use a recyclable steel keg is probably cheaper. But if you're traveling long distance, these kegs fit in well, and they can reduce your cost of transport. So here's a situation where there's a technology that's interesting and progressive, and there's plastic, but plastic is recyclable, but it's not reusable. You can't go into this and reuse it. You have to have a fitting that most bars have to allow you to pressurize the container and move the drink into a bar stand and then into your glass. But it's a situation where you're encouraged to recycle, but you have to think twice about recycling it. If you have a resource that takes reasonably soft plastic, but it's still getting near to hard plastic, which is difficult to recycle. But as we go into the new year, we look at plastics as one of the things we could do something about and recycle. Many people do not recycle it, especially in the downtown areas where there's no readily available recycling for metal or cardboard. Cardboard is sometimes provided by a separate container, but metals and plastics and those recyclable materials aren't always able to find a convenient receptacle or of disposal. So that's why you get chairs and other recyclable materials in the garbage, which in turn goes to the landfill. So as you're thinking of the new year coming, think about that one form of plastic that could be recycled. Last week we were talking about Australia and a little town where I grew up, little village, a post office, blacksmith shop, a couple of houses, and up the road a one teacher's school where my father taught, and a little church way around the corner, about a mile from the junction of a road that went from Bellingen to Dorrigo, with up the escarpment of the east coast of Australia. We had mentioned that plates were moving over each other, and there's a great divide, which is a mountain along the east coast of Australia. It's not that high, but it was tremendously difficult for people to get across it. My father taught at Thora, which used to be Never Never, until they decided to change its name. And then we were on the upper reaches of the Bellinger River, which was a fast-flowing river that flowed out into the Pacific. And it drained that escarpment, which was about 2,000 feet high. And at the top of the escarpment, there was volcanic activity, because when you lift and rumble a landmass, there are cracks that occur, and then you get volcanic action coming through. So there were outliers of edaphic forest, which means that they're dependent on the soil type, which comes from the basaltic or other rich materials coming up from volcanic action. The regular landscape was very poor, but the species were interesting. Typical Australian dry sclerophyll forest, trees, and understory vegetation that is rather wonderful. I thought before I left Thora, my father did move on to Grafton, and we have, with David's help, we've put up maps of some of these places, so you get an idea of how slow-flowing rivers move to the west and to the Australian Bight, which is where Adelaide is. And in some cases, especially where there's a snowy mountain hydroelectric system, the fast-flowing rivers flowing to the east are captured, and the water flows into the slow-flowing rivers, provides for irrigation, but as the water falls from, in the case of Mount Kosciuszko, it's 7,000 feet. As the water falls, it generates hydroelectricity. So all along that coast are spots where there are little rivers that are running east, and big rivers that are flowing west. They seem to be slow, but they actually do move faster than you think. It's often that you regard slow-flowing rivers because they meander slowly, and they're not running over a lot of rock and rubble and creating waterfalls. But in actual fact, that water does move fast. It also dries up, so in seasons not too long ago, one of these dams on the west side that accepts the water from the east side and generates electricity, one of those dams was down to about 4 feet of water, which was very, very low. And it was interesting to see that all the towns that had been flooded over by the dam were again visible, and even old roads and railroad beds could be viewed. So go back to Thora. I thought I would say something about growing up as a young fellow in that community. And one of the things that was a feature of the year was the picnic, the annual picnic. And I thought I would run through some of the things that would happen in association with the picnic. The first thing you would notice was a couple of weeks before the annual Thora picnic, there would be notices going out, but there would also be people coming to work, mostly with scythes, to cut down the grass on the horse paddock, where children would come to school with their horses, and to tidy up flat areas so that you would have flat races and typical athletic events for boys and girls. And then there would be added obstacle courses and things like that. So obstacle courses had to be designed. I can remember pinning down a large tarpaulin, and the obstacle course meant that you had to crawl through the tarpaulin. Or then you would have a hog, well, it was sort of like a net that you could put a hog underneath it and couldn't get out. It was also a challenge to be either climbing up and over a hog net or going underneath it. You may have to run or walk or do other things that would be an obstacle course. So that had to be prepared. There had to be places for people to bring their food and where they could sit down and eat or watch the races. There were races for couples, like there would be three-legged races where you tie two legs together and you race. So you have to be pretty understanding of each other. You would have sack races where you put a person in a potato sack and they have to run in the potato sack. You'd have apple bobs where you put an apple on a string and you have to eat it in a string, or you have to get it out of a tub of water. You had competitions. There's a rather famous Australian lolly, it would be called. It was a mint, and minties had a paper wrap around them. And the challenge there was to see who could make the longest continuous strip out of tearing around a mint wrapper. Same could happen with peelings for apples. Could you peel simply enough to get a long, thin apple strip? There were tug-of-wars, relay races, high jumps, broad jumps, and there's sometimes a cricket match. The school grounds was on a hill, so a cricket match would be on a cricket pitch which had been carved out of the landscape with the aid of a grader that was working the roads, but it was encouraged to come in and make a cricket patch. I remember bowling on that cricket pitch. It was largely clay, so your cricket ball did bounce. You could, just as in baseball, you can shine one side of your ball and that little rim of stitched part of the ball would catch the air, and you could make the ball swing in and out, and and confuse the batsman. There was a backstop behind, and if the batsman clicked the ball, and the backstop would catch it, and that man would be out. So some people would play football, cricket. I'm sorry. There was no football. I remember going to school, boarding school, and that was the first time that I had encountered football, and I didn't exactly know about shoes that had sprigs on them and football cleats, but I soon learned and was a part of that. With the adults, sometimes there were axemanship. Some people were working with lumber and were very good at competitively chopping a log in two. So you would have small logs pinned down, and there was a competition to see who could get through the same sized log quickly. Sometimes you had an artificial tree that was vertical, and the axeman had to work on the verticality of the tree. Sometimes you had to put a board into the tree, make a hollow so that you could put a board in, and then you stood on the board to reach the place where you were supposed to axe. Some of these competitors are almost professional, but others are quite amateur, and it was fun to see people engaging in that sort of activity. The picnic was always catered for by a staff of people who, first of all, cooked a hog's head or meat and vegetables, and made sandwiches, tomato sandwiches especially. And they prepared some days before for the school picnic. The hog's head would be boiled and then wrapped up in, put in a camp stove. It was a very big container, cast iron container, and you put your hog's head in that hot, and then wrap the camp oven in blankets so it cooked of its own accord after being very hot. Sometimes that, on one occasion, that hog's head didn't work quite properly, so we did have people with ptomaine poisoning, so the picnic didn't end up quite the way it was intended, and these things happen. Sometimes there would be a dance afterwards, so I thought I'd just run through a local dance. This was in the day when we did have radio. We didn't have electricity. We had battery-run radios, Stromberg, Carlson, and other breeds that were probably here as well as in Australia. But the dance hall was relatively large. It had a very good, probably a type of wood that was a little on the greasy side, so your dance floor in those days was very, very fast. You could, good dancers expected the dance floor to be fast. They wore shoes that were pumps that were very, very thin, so you could feel every little bump in the floor. And then when the time came, you put together candle wax and kerosene and sawdust, and you warmed it in the galley that was behind the hall, and then sprinkled that over the floor and had a huge broom to sweep it off. But that gave it an added shine and fast. So if you walked across the floor, you were very careful because you were likely to sit down. Again, you would have a group of people that would come and make wood for the galley. They would make sure that the outdoor toilets were available and not overgrown. There was an economy in this small community, and I can remember that the men's toilet had a shield around it, sort of a blind that was made from tar barrels. Had been tarring the road between Bellingen and Dorrigo, and there were these barrels left over. So instead of using expensive corrugated iron, they opened up these barrels, and that was part of the toilet shelter. The music was run by the Hensons usually. Mr. Henson was the local grocer. He would come with a truck with a bunch of groceries. You could either order your food ahead of time. You might have called it in on a phone where there was an exchange, and you would run outside and your backside was sticking out this little box that had a telephone in it. So you may have called up your order. But Mr. Henson's avocation was playing the drums, and his wife played the piano. She sometimes played the piano from about 6 inches above the keys, so the piano was reasonably loud, and young folk who were prepared to sing were invited to do that. Early in the night, the young children would be dancing by themselves, or adults would take a kindly curl or two with the children. The teenagers would sometimes congregate around the galley where hot water was being boiled for intermission tea. Older teenagers were sitting on the veranda waiting to jump into progressive dances where they could learn how to dance. And when they jumped into the progressive dance, there was an equal number of people dancing as couples. But when the time came for a progressive waltz, the couples separated, and that time you could jump in and add an extra person. Eventually somebody lost out, so you would see a lost soul who'd lost his place, but he had a sense of humor and would jump in again, and perhaps you would lose out next time. But there were other dances. There were barn dances. There were shotties. There was a dance where you did 1, 2, 3, and then it slid, and you would do that with a whole series of 6 people in a row. 1, 2, 3, shh, and the music would be with that. There was always a little bit of drink around, and sometimes there would be a rambunctious person who might take a liking to checking out the drummer, and but that was part of the event. The men usually congregated at the front end of the hall. The women were sitting around seats that were permanent seats around the side. When a dance was announced, a two-step or a waltz or a Jolly Miller, you would pick your partner. And there were some rules of the game. If you brought someone, you had the first dance and you had the last dance. And there were sometimes small skirmishes about who was having the last dance with your girlfriend. At intermission time, the young folk would be purloined into taking cups around. So everyone got a cup, and then everyone got to have tea or coffee, but usually tea. The water coming from the galley outside. There was a kitchenette where people put together sandwiches and prepared food. After the intermission, usually the young children got to go to sleep in the dressing room, and so you would see all these kids lined up with rugs across them. That were the time of night had come when it was too late for them to stay awake. That was followed on the morning afterwards. We would go around and pick up beer bottles, mainly so that they didn't get to be under people's tires. But in those days, there were no cans of beer. It was beer in a bottle. An Australian bottle is 26 ounces, so it's quite a little bit of beer. So those two things were a part of our life. But now I want to take off to another part of Australia. Along that escarpment, my father, the school that he was teaching at, the state decided to consolidate small schools, and so he had to move to a new location, and we went to the Clarence River, and we put a map of the Clarence River up on the YouTube and on about public television. The area that was the catchment area for the Clarence River was quite large. The escarpment, or the Great Divide as it's called, or the Blue Mountains in another location, mainly because they look blue if you're in a distance, were high. They were often rocky, often sedimentary rocks that had been under the sea. You could even see the current bedding where the sandstone had been laid down or the shale had been laid down. And in the Clarence River case, the Great Divide was a little lower, so that was a place where you could take a railroad off and up onto the heights of the mountains behind. I grew up there some because I would come back from being at an agricultural high school as a boarding person, and I would work with the beekeeper next door, and he would go up into the hinterlands of the Clarence River and locate his bees on pastures or on forested areas, and then in wintertime they would usually come back to near the ocean where there was Australian heather. It looked a little bit like Scottish heather, but not as dramatic as the Scottish heather. So he was used to moving bees, and I would help with that. We were on both the Clarence River and the Bellinger River. We were faced with January, that's summer floods. This is almost monsoonal. So the flatlands were rich in material that had come down from volcanoes and other sites that were relatively rich, but they were flatlands. So they got their wealth from the soil that was deposited there by floods, but they also had to face the floods. Sometimes that meant that you lost your crop if there was a flood, or if you were lucky, the water would come up and go down and you would save your crop. Every once in a while, the flood was really serious and people would have to be out with boats rescuing people off their roofs. And they weren't appreciated because it was felt that they should have evacuated instead of assuming that the hazard would not happen. It's very, very typical. People don't believe the hazard is actually going to happen as predicted, and they stay and stay and stay, and in the long run they have to make a hole in the roof and sit on the roof. And it's very dangerous to go and rescue some of those people. You almost have to tie your boat together with other boats and make sure that you don't get your boat washed downstream as you're trying to rescue people. So the Clarence was where my father was for a while, and then he went back to the slopes, perhaps 200 miles west of Sydney. So when I would visit my people in that location, I would travel the 60-mile coastal plain from Sydney to the mountains. Then you would go up over the Blue Mountains and down the other side. Those mountains were relatively hard to get over. They weren't so high and challenging in terms of height. They were challenging in terms of they were like mesas. The mountains were flat, and the material underneath often was softer than the material on top. So you would have like canyons, and you could go up the canyon, but you couldn't get onto the top of the mountain. So early settlers had a hard time getting over that mountain to the slopes on the other side. Later, my father moved back to be closer to Sydney and to his children. And as you get seniority in the statewide educational system, you can move closer to sites that you would prefer to be at. So father was on the upper reaches of, or the lower reaches of the Blue Mountains. So in a good clear day, you could stand on the mountain edge and see Sydney Harbour Bridge about 40 miles away as the crow flies, but that's about 60 miles away as the road flies or as the trains travel. My parents were on Old Bathurst Road, and Old Bathurst Road was a zigzag road made by convicts. So you would take your bullock train gradually up a slope, and then there would be a hairpin bend, and you come back and you go along. So it's like a Z. You keep going up the hill, and it's a road that is usually gravel with big boulders because you're trying to stabilize the soil, but it is a sort of dangerous road to travel up if you have a respect for the sump of your car. So in the long run, the state reinstated that road as a major road, and it still had its convict zigzags, but it got up to the top of the hill, and then you were on the flat or tabletop mountain. There was a lower mountains, and then there's a higher mountains, and people did have trouble getting down the other side of that mountain onto the slopes and plains. Trains had the same problem. They had to go up this escarpment face, and they did that as a zigzag. You would have the train would line up on a flat land, possibly with an engine in front and an engine behind, and then you would gradually get speed up and jump up to another level and keep going back and forth, doing that till you got to the top of the hill. Then you would be out of steam. So you had to have a dam with water on the top of the hill to replenish your water and to fill the tender. The same happened going down the other side of the mountain. You'd travel perhaps 30 or 40 miles across the mountain and then went down the other side. Some of these sites have been modernized with tunnels, so now trains don't do that sort of zigzag stunt, but it was the way first settlers got there. And when you couldn't go down the other side, you used to bring your sheep to the top of the hill and load them onto railroads there, because the railroad hadn't quite figured out how to get down the other side. But tunnels help, and gentle, fairly well-engineered tracks help that. Sometimes it was encouraged by the presence of coal, sedimentary rock, and in some places there was coal, and coal could be taken out by rail. Not too many trucks in early days, so rails were rather important. And my brother lived on the slopes there, a place called Orange, and he was an engineer in a small local government unit, not unlike a county here. So he's a county engineer. And he married into that area, and Beverly is from a little town called Cudell. Well, my sister lives also in this area that is the east coast of Australia. It's the arable part of Australia. Most of Australia is fairly dry, and this arable portion of Australia is what is fed by slow-flowing rivers that are fed by fast-flowing rivers. They just look fast because they have to have waterfalls and fall over things, but in actual fact, the slow-flowing rivers do move fast too. That's as long as they have enough water. So my sister lives at Albury on the junction with Victoria, state. She actually lives in New South Wales, but just across the line is the state of Victoria. And there, in the distance, with snow caps, which is pretty unusual for Australia, are the Snowy Mountains, and this is Australia's seventh wonder of the world, and it's a collection of dams and tunnels and hydroelectric systems, and the water eventually runs out and feeds into the rivers that flow to the center of the Australian Bight and out to the Indian Ocean. That water can augment irrigation, but it also can be dammed in places so that river traffic can move up the territory with a number of locks that allow the ship to rise up to the next level, and so a series of dams allows that river to be navigated. So imagine that you still have that slope on the backside of the mountain, and the fast-flowing rivers, the Snowy River and the like, running to the east. The center of Australia is rather different. It has it's very flat. There's a lake called Lake Eyre, and that it's often dry for 5 years, but when rain comes, everything changes. Instead of driving across the bed of Lake Eyre, the postman has to put his vehicle on a punt and punt it across to the other side, and it might be many square miles, so it's a long punt, and everything is ephemeral. It grows quickly, and for perhaps 10 days, there's this world of flowers and seeds, and within a few days it goes, and the seeds are buried for perhaps another 5 years of drought. So you have quite a contrast between the arable east coast of Australia and a little bit in Western Australia and the rest of the country, which is low rainfall and often desert species. We discussed the other day that Australians, like Americans, tended to push their agriculture a little far out into the dry hinterlands, and that didn't work very well because when drought came, there were dust storms, and the soils that had been disturbed to plant the wheat or other crops blew out across the Pacific Ocean and could even be observed in New Zealand. And you look at the sun and it was blue mainly because the light was being refracted by particles of dust in the air. It didn't make for very friendly living because you ate dust and you slept in dust and you hoped that this dust storm would blow through and be done. We're getting to be to near the end. I hope you all had a nice Christmas, as I did, and that you will have a happy New Year. We are blessed with a kickboard trail to Danville, which is our major event this year. But we have been also watching electric grid improvements that have been on our prairies. We've had to watch to see that the plants that are planted are acceptable. But we'll go on with prairie preservation during the year, and we hope that some of you will come and help and enjoy finding out about your local ecosystem, which is almost non-existent. So with that, I'll say this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.